What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. One quick note, we're going to focus on Ladder and then Sanctum, so if you're looking for Sanctum, check in the description or in the timestamps so you can skip ahead to the Sanctum Decks. When I do one of these videos, I like to think that I'm equipping you with the tools to understand the metagame in Marvel Snap and the reason why it is the way that it is. So while typically I will have these videos in a rough power ranking order, sometimes I think it's more important to talk about the level 1 of the metagame or the why the metagame is why it is the way it is right now. And so I think in order to make that happen in this video, the only place to start a tier list here is with Hela. And I don't think that necessarily means Hela is the best deck in the game right now, but it is the patient zero for the metagame. It is the biggest proximate cause of why certain decks are good and why certain decks are bad. Bluntly, the buff to Scar, or I guess the nerf to Scar in every deck but Hela, but the buff to Scar in Hela, moving it up to 7 costs, makes this deck much more consistent in terms of point output, because it now has a 7 cost, it now has an 8 cost, it has massive 6 costs, and that means that Hela is playable, consistent, and I think this is also crucial, very easy to play. This is a deck that's easy to pick up and play, and you understand basically exactly what you're doing with it. There's some intricacies, but fundamentally, your point output is very, very high. Now, the major problem that Hela has, in so much as it is a level 1 deck, is that the decks that beat Hela are pretty overwhelmingly doing things that people don't really like, or that lead to games of Marvel Snap that are not particularly compelling. And what I mean by this is Hela being the deck that starts this metagame off means that a lot of the sort of intricate mid-range duels that we saw in the past, where certain tech decisions and positioning really mattered, are sort of out the window, because what Hela does is force every mid-range deck to say, can I beat Hela? And for 99% of them, the answer is no. So it pushes the metagame towards a very yes or no, all or nothing style of Marvel Snap. Full disclosure, this is not my preferred style of gameplay, and it is the major reason why I bag on Hela as much as I do. She is often the proximate cause for a lot of what I consider Marvel Snap's worst metagames. This one is pretty similar to the other Hela metagames. When you have a deck that is this consistent and this kind of point output, what it does is say, can you go over me or can you go under me? Going over Hela looks a lot like Mr. Negative, doing something that has more points than it, various ongoing combo decks, things of that nature. Going under Hela looks a lot like Clog. And so right now, those are the sort of ascendant strategies in the metagame. And that means that there's not as much nuance in this metagame as there is in other metagames. Because if you're not beating Hela, you're not tall enough to ride. Everything else that plays cards like Sam Wilson and Iron Patriot, all of those mid-range decks that we thought were so incredibly sweet just a week ago, are getting forced out of the metagame by just the raw numbers of this deck. That's not to say they immediately become unplayable, but what I will say is, I now no longer consider them major balance issues in the immediate moment. And a lot of that is because of the sheer raw numbers that can be accessed by this deck. There is one other major variant of Hela tooling around. The difference between these decks is that this one has Sam, of course not Sam Wilson, that is to say Silver Samurai, and of course Gore that goes along with it. The real difference is just the 6-drop suite and the fact that this Silver Samurai inclusion gives you a little bit of disruption against decks that are trying to go over the top of you. Hela is a very one-note deck, and I think at this point it's pretty understood you can go over the top of it with bigger combo or under it with Clog, and I think having this added disruption can be a meaningful benefit. Going over the top of Hela looks a lot like Mr. Negative, and you'll notice I never really apply the sort of arguments I apply to Hela to a deck like Mr. Negative. Mr. Negative, to me, is what combos should look like in Marvel Snap. This is a deck that can be handled by mid-range decks, by the card Mobius M. Mobius. This is a deck that has meaningful and powerful tech against it. It's a deck that invests in magic and can get rug pulled that way. This is a deck that has meaningful points of weakness that can be attacked by other decks that are not just trying to go over the top or clog it all the way up. Now, that's not to say that Clog isn't very good against Mr. Negative. It absolutely is. But it does mean that this deck is less all or nothing or less metagame enforcing than Hela is. You can beat Mr. Negative with some smart applications of tech cards in an otherwise normal deck. It's very difficult to do that when it comes to actually beating Hela. Mr. Negative is there to go over the top. And a lot of the time, the way Hela metagames sort of even themselves out is that everyone starts building against Hela to a degree that eventually means that Hela is a little less playable, and then these other decks, like Mr. Negative, like Clog, that have much more defined counterplay that you can do in a normal deck, are going to be able to show up and do what they do. And so that is the hope here. Mr. Negative is sort of the hope of the people here, that you can just sort of bully Hela, but it does sort of create a very polarized metagame. And that is ultimately the issue with many quote-unquote Hela metas, is they're very much, oh, I know what matchup I'm in, I'm extremely favored in this matchup, I'm going to snap, and then games just sort of start ending on turn 3 when people realize that. And Mr. Negative very much epitomizes yes or no metagames. Aha, I've played Mr. Negative, and my opponent isn't playing a deck that is likely to include Mobius M. Mobius. Well, I guess I'm simply going to win the game. That yes or no style of gameplay can be cool for a small amount of time, but I think over a longer period of time, it does have some issues that will start to show. Mr. Negative is the best deck in the game at bullying Hela. You are absolutely able to bully snap into that deck. There's no room for tech in it. It's not really like it's going to be able to do much about what you're doing. You have more points than them. You have inverted Iron Man. You have inverted Gore. You have inverted Mystique. You have a bunch of stupid stuff. Yes, they might have a Silver Samurai. Yes, that might be mildly worrying. But no, the matchup is not going to be in their favor anytime soon. In order to deal with metagames that are heavily predicated on synergistic combo decks that explode in power late into the game, Clog has very often been a relevant sort of counterweight to that. I am not the biggest fan of the magic builds of Clog, just generally, because I think they present a weakness that is otherwise not necessarily present. But every time I tried to play a tempo build of Clog, I ended up feeling like it just wasn't doing the job that it needs to do very well. One of the things about Hela, which is sort of target number 1 here, is that Hela is a deck that wants to end the game on turn 6. It's got a big 6 drop that ends the game. It's not actually built to go 7 turns. That 7th turn is almost purely to the advantage of the Clog player, so Magic ends up being a bit of a tech card against Hela in a weird way. This also is a deck that has a very good matchup against Mr. Negative, because Mr. Negative needs space on the board in order to play its cards. If you take that space away, they are going to lose the game, and that is pretty simply straightforward. This is a deck that, again, we talk about the problems I have with Hela. It creates metagames like this, where you have basically just like 3 of the least fun to play against decks in the world are the top 3 decks on my tier list. And it's not necessarily that I think they're all 3 the best deck in the game, but these are the ones that you're going to see a lot. They're the major things that are moving the metagame right now, and they are what you have to figure out how you want to beat if you want to play against this. Now, much the same way that Mr. Negative has weaknesses to Mobius and Legion, the Clog deck has weaknesses very specifically to stuff that runs Killmonger, stuff that runs Legion, stuff that is able to unclog itself, Annihilus, for example. I've even seen people running Annihilus in this exact list, basically, as a way of getting the Clog mirror in their favor. Clog is, I think, in my opinion, maybe the best deck in the game right now, a very powerful method of dealing with a metagame that is extremely focused on going tall. In a go tall metagame, discard is very much able to compete. One thing that I have noticed is that a lot of these so-called go tall decks are decks that are looking very specifically to have certain cards on the board at certain times, which has meant that Gambit has come back in lieu of the Grandmaster. Grandmaster is a powerful card, but is sort of very specifically limited to your Dakin lines. Dakin lines are very powerful, but so is blowing up your opponent's Hell Cow, for example. This is a deck that has a lot of upside, a lot of general ability to vomit power onto the board, and some very specific nut draws that can compete with many of the go tall decks in the game. This deck and the next deck we're going to talk about are what I like to consider mid-range decks with combo endgames. And it is sort of relevant in the context of this metagame that these are the decks that play the most like the type of mid-range decks that the metagame has been dominated by for a while now. Now, I realize that there is a bit of hypocrisy here. I'm out here saying, oh, I like mid-range decks, and so I don't like when they're not playable. Perhaps that is just my opinion. I do think, though, that there is something to be said about games actually getting to turn 6, and Combo sort of doesn't let that happen a lot. This is a deck that is you are basically able to cope with this deck. You can stay in games against these decks that are comboing off and not actually get as bullied out. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the time you're still going to get outpointed when they're nutting off. So your goal here is to win the games where they're sort of in the middle of their output, because your average output is going to be a little bit higher and your high-end output is competitive. Another version of a mid-range deck with a combo endgame is the Moonstone Go Tall deck. This deck leverages the power of multiple Iron Men in the form of Iron Man, Mystique, and then applying Moonstone to a Mystiqued Iron Man that allows it to get to point totals that can compete with or even exceed Hela and Mr. Negative matchups. It's not going to beat every Mr. Negative matchup, but you can actually do it. This is a deck that has massive Go Tall ability, but can also play a mid-range game with Sam Wilson and Captain America, and Spectrum allows you to handle those mid-range games as well. You also have access to Luke Cage, which is a very powerful card in its own right. The combination of Luke Cage and Anti-Venom is very relevant. And of course, Luke Cage has the additional upside of beating the living crap out of the Ajax matchups. Ajax is a relevant deck in this metagame. Of the sort of formerly relevant mid-range decks, it is the only one that I'm seeing that has like major gameplay still. A lot of the formerly relevant mid-range decks have really fallen off in the face of this Hela onslaught. And so we have the only remaining guy standing is like Ajax, because I think it just got 2 new cute tools in the form of Diamondback and Laufey. But I'm not necessarily sure that that is enough to make it a good option. And frankly, the prevalence of this deck makes it a much worse option because of how good Luke Cage is into a deck whose point output, especially with Diamondback and Laufey included, is nearly entirely predicated on the ability to actually afflict your opponent with negative points. On that subject, I think Ajax is the sort of mid-rangey Iron Patriot deck with the best shot at surviving in a metagame that is about going this tall, and a lot of that is because of the tools it has access to. This is a deck that has, of course, access to the card Iron Patriot, which allows you to cheat energy. It has access to Anti-Venom, which allows you to cheat energy. It has access to Malekith, which allows you to cheat energy. It has access to all of these cards that play for bigger than they are. US Agent can be relevant to the Hela matchups. There's a lot of energy cheat in this mid-range shell that in theory should allow it to be a deck that has output that is not all that much smaller than the decks that are able to legitimately compete with Hela and Mr. Negative and things like that. Ultimately, though, I think this is a deck that people are used to, people are able to consistently play, it'll be fine, but it will ultimately be nothing special, and the fact that there are these decks running around that just have Luke Cages included, I've run into Mr. Negative decks playing Luke Cage. You just get absolutely massively 8-cubed by a surprise Luke Cage in a way that very few other decks are as vulnerable to basically any card, right? Like, if you're playing Hela, like, yeah, you don't like seeing a Fenris Wolf, but you know it's there, and you can calculate for its existence because it has to be on the board, right? If you're playing Mr. Negative and you run into a Mobius M. Mobius, you know it's there before the game ends. And so you end up in these situations with Ajax where, like, it is the one deck in the game right now, or in the widely played metagame, that is able to be sufficiently rug pulled at a massive rate with just a random card that may or may not be in your opponent's deck. And I think that is, if there is a major weakness here, the biggest problem. We are in a combo meta. It should come as no surprise that people are willing to play Phoenix Force. I think the major use case for Phoenix Force right now is just that it has more power than Hela stuff is able to contest, either with the combination of Phoenix Force and Multiple Man, or Phoenix Force, Human Torch, and Arnim Zola, or Shuri and Nimrod, and various destroy cards. All of those lines are generally going to be able to outpower things that are not not able to interact with you. And because there are such a wide variety of combo decks in the meta right now between Hela and Mr. Negative and this, and even Discard for an example, and the ongoing decks, like, there's just kind of not a lot of room to play enough tech cards for all of those matchups, right? You're not seeing a lot of Shadow Kings running around right now. It's just not really a huge part of the metagame, because what are you going to do when you queue into Hela with your Shadow King? You're just going to feel really stupid the entire game. And so you have this ability, or this dynamic, where the combo decks have such disparate answers that they're all sort of protecting each other from any one deck being able to beat all of them. So Phoenix Force is existing in the shadow of Mr. Negative, in the shadow of Hela, and has a reasonable matchup into them because of the numbers it can put on the board. It's, again, not going to be the greatest thing in the world, not consistently, but right now, nobody's really running the things that are meaningfully able to deal with what this card is putting on, what this deck is putting onto the board. You're not like seeing a bunch of Cosmo combo decks. People are trying it, and it's not good enough against Hela. It's not good enough against Mr. Negative. And so, like, you're just kind of getting to do what this deck wants to do ad infinitum. And that is really the lesson of this metagame, where it's like, if you're a combo sicko, like maybe you play Yu-Gi-Oh a little bit, this is your time. I've heard some buzz about people saying they can play like Alioth Cosmo in the old move deck, and like that's your Hela plan. I have not seen a lot of evidence for that actually being good, but I mean, at the same time, I still don't know what the hell the 12th card is supposed to be in this deck. I've tried Adam Warlock, I've tried Nico Minoru, I've tried Hulkbuster. Hulkbuster is the one that does the coolest stuff, but it also, like, does nothing if you're not doing stuff already. So it's a weird sort of balance here. Maybe the Nico is right. I was pretty sure it wasn't, but at this point, I'm as lost as the next guy in terms of what the 12th card is supposed to be here. I've seen Penny Parker, exact same dynamic as Hulkbuster, basically, where it's like, all right, you know, you got some cool stuff going on, but this is not the best use of your energy unless you're doing something else. And so you have a deck that has the ability, this is a deck that has numbers out the ass when it goes crazy, right? Like, this is a Human Torch deck, it scales massively, but because the metagame is so tall, you're no longer guaranteed the win in a lot of these matchups. Like, you need specific things to happen in order to outscale even a Hela deck, honestly, at this point. Now, you can get those things to happen. You've got some great scalers in this deck. But, like, specifically, Dagger is at a pretty much of a low point right now. Dagger, of all of your scalers, is the one that is most dependent on your opponent, like, not being a combo deck. It's the one that's best into mid-range decks on small moves, right? So, like, you have, like, one big guy, and then your Dagger is, like, the I'm moving this twice, and it's winning another lane kind of card. And so right now, Dagger is sort of at a nadir, while Human Torch and Vulture are much more important because they're sort of uncapped scalers in that sense. Like, these are scalers that can scale regardless of what your opponent is doing, and that matters a lot when your opponent is playing Hela. You got like 2 cards in every lane, and Dagger's getting +4, and you're just like, what is even the point of this? So on the whole, the deck is sort of, I'm starting to get a perception of this deck as like, this is the combo deck that is good for succeeding in mid-range metagames because it's good at dodging interaction, right? Right now, though, we need a combo deck that is good at succeeding in combo deck metagames, and I don't think that Move Bounce necessarily fits the bill. Weirdly, this is sort of the quote-unquote mid-rangey answer to the metagame. You are a deck that has a bunch of numbers, which means you can theoretically compete with Hela. You have Mobius for Mr. Negative, you have Luke Cage for the Ajax decks, you have Super Skrull for the ongoing mirrors. This is actually like kind of like a full tech deck. Like, that's, I know it doesn't necessarily look like it, but this is the closest thing a metagame gets to, like, this gets to, like, Sarah Tech. Like, this is the deck with, like, the 3 tech cards and then all the points. Like, that's actually what's happening here. You've got your Super Skrull in case you run into, like, someone who's making a bunch of Iron Men. You got copying Captain Americas and stuff like that. You got your Doom 2099 game plan. You've got your Mobius for Mr. Negative, your Luke Cage for the Ajax decks. You got points for Hela. It all makes sense. There is a lot going for this deck. The ultimate downside, though, is that, like, whenever you run into one of those decks that's, like, you know, a Phoenix Force or whatever, they just bully you forever. They just, like, bully the entire game. Because if they do their thing, you're just sitting there looking at them like, ah, yes, I have a lane full of 6-power guys. And they're looking at you like, ah, yes, I have a lane full of 8 to 12 power guys. and then you lose because 8 to 12 is more than 6. When you look at trying to solve this metagame with a control deck, it tends to look a lot like this. We just talked about one version of trying to solve this metagame with a control deck. This is like a harder control read here, basically. And you can even see the problem where it's like, this is a deck that has a card for most matchups in the game, but it doesn't necessarily have a card that will do enough in most matchups in the game. Like, as an example, Fenris Wolf against Hela is really strong. It's a really powerful thing to do. Very good. But it's not going to guarantee you a win. It's, like, pretty damn good. But especially if they're playing, like, the Silver Samurai Gore version, it's not ever getting their biggest guy. And, like, you can actually still lose games because you just don't have a ton of points in here. And you're playing Gladiator against Hela, which is not a good option a lot of the time. And that's where a lot of your points are located in this deck. And so you have Killmonger for Clog, which I actually think that of the major reasons to play a deck like this, like having a good Clog matchup is one of, if not the best reason to play a deck like this, is because of the Killmonger stuff. That's great. You have the Invisible Woman to make sure your Killmonger hits the bounce stuff. People are playing move bounce or Joaquin Torres normal bounce, which a lot of people started playing Joaquin Torres normal bounce. It eventually kind of fell off, in part because of this, but in part because of just the sheer numbers that the metagame was able to put up. It is the exact kind of deck that is like pretty good, but the numbers just don't add up on the whole. And you have, anti-magic deck tech in the form of Legion. You have Enchantress. You have Shang-Chi. You got a lot of stuff, but you need it just to be in the matchup, is sort of the dynamic that I felt playing this deck, where it's like, you need your tech just to compete. Your tech isn't winning you games. It can, but it's just there so you as a mid-range deck can compete. This is the worst meta for Arishem in recent memory. Like, I genuinely cannot think of a good matchup that Arishem has. Its good matchups are just like when it gets lucky and does something unfair to disrupt its combo opponents in a meaningful way. But this is not the kind of deck that can adapt to metagames like this. Like, someone plays Hela against you, you're on Eliath or I lose. Like, Eliath, a scam, or I lose. And that is basically every matchup now. Like, every person you play against is doing some sort of combo garbage against you, and you're just like, I'm playing a guy one turn above the curve. Eat it. I got a 5-drop on 6. And they're like, here is a Gore, and here is a Mystique on that Gore. And you're like, oh, okay, I lose. And then when you look at like the normal mid-range decks, even the normal mid-range decks, like, okay, if they Wiccan, they're also above curve now, and they have tech for you, and they're playing a 12-card deck. If they're Ajaxing, they might have Cassandra Nova, for the love of God, which is just horrific. But even the normal Ajax strategy of, like, get an Ajax out on 5, that guy's gonna get really big. Lot of Afflict, Diamondback really relevant, US Agent really relevant. Like, you just end up in these spots where it's like, I don't know what his good matchups even are. I don't know what I'm supposed to do when I play this deck. It's Arishem, it can't be that bad. But, like, of all the decks we've talked about, none of them are things Arishem is like, yeah, I'm so happy to see this. Similar attempt at mid-range cheat and tech. This is basically the same concept as the Wiccan deck, but instead of using our energy cheat in certain areas like Wiccan, our energy cheat is in the form of Mysterio. Our energy cheat is in the form of course, Mockingbird and Sasquatch. And that gives this deck a little bit more verticality, which is relevant against those games where, like, the combo deck is happening, but they're not really fully comboing off, and you can actually beat them with points. You do care about your tech a lot. I've seen some issues, like different versions of this deck. Like, I think maybe cutting Galacta could make sense. Getting specific tech for certain matchups in the deck could make sense. This is a deck that also has a little bit of splash weakness to Mobius. So in a world where Mr. Negative really takes over, could be awkward for you. But on the whole, I think it sort of fits into this, I'm a good player, I want to play a deck where I have options and choices, and it's not just yes or no. But ultimately, the metagame is very yes or no right now, and this is the kind of thing that needs the metagame to move a little bit. It also has a very poor Clog matchup for obvious reasons. Couple honorable mention decks from high-ranked players. This is something Derek has been messing around with, attempting to use Professor X to counter Hela and Mr. Negative, and generally ramp it out early with a Luna Snow. Do some cool stuff like that. I think it's a cool idea. I think there's probably potential here. I think the lack of move in the metagame right now makes this actually make a lot more sense. Last time Hela was prominent, Professor X was a good answer to it, if I recall correctly, or maybe that was 2 Helas ago. I don't exactly remember, but before they nerfed Professor X, this was a real thing you could do. And this was, again, sort of the original complaint about Hela was when Hela is good, it gives rise to these sort of very binary metagames. Like, oh, you're playing Hela? I'll play my most degenerate Professor X deck to try to beat your Hela deck. I'll play a Clog deck to try to beat your Hela deck. I'll play Mr. Negative to try to beat your Hela deck. It just creates a lot of, whoo, geez, that's just not a game I ever really had a shot in. And this is another deck that is attempting to create games where you just never really had a shot in them. It was just, oh, a thing happened to me. That's great. Crazy played this Thanos list up to the top 10. I am very suspicious in the sense that this sort of looks like, you know, if someone told me, KM, this is the best deck in the game, I'd be like, I don't believe you because I want to. I want to believe this is the best deck in the game. I want to believe you can play stuff like this. The real advantage, I think, of a Thanos deck is that people don't really feel super comfortable snapping you because they have no idea what your range is anymore. Like, whenever you play against Thanos, it's kind of hard to snap them because you're just like, I don't really know what they're gonna do. Like, I don't know what is in here. I don't know what is possible. And so it sort of has this, like, almost sort of bluff shield where, like, a guy that is definitely gonna beat you, like a Mr. Negative gamer or a Hela gamer, they're definitely going to beat you, but they don't really feel like they're going to beat you. And so you're just like, haha, you don't actually get to snap into me, and you get to, like, limp into a lot of games. It's pretty cool. I have some suspicion as to, like, whether or not this actually, like, fully seriously holds up, but I really want it to. I really, really do. All right, long-ass video about to get longer. Let's talk about the top 5 decks in Sanctum Showdown. After the bans in Sanctum Showdown, the meta quickly coalesced around Zoo as the new best thing to do. This is just a pretty straightforward example of why Zoo is so good. Mockingbird is extremely big. This is also a deck that has Shauna as a very relevant way of attacking multiple lanes at the same time. Of all the decks in Sanctum, this is probably the best at picking up points in the off lane, and that is weirdly pretty relevant. It's not going to be the greatest thing ever, but free points are free points, and this deck is just as good at contesting the Sanctum as any other deck in the game, and it also gets those free points. It is a little bit Mockingbird dependent, but your Mockingbird is an absolutely dominant card when it comes down early enough into the game. You get a lead, you snowball that lead, you pick up the free points in the off lanes because you are a deck that contests not just the main lane, but also the off lanes. You are stacking additional points, and that is really interesting. This is a deck that has a more interesting dynamic in Sanctum Showdown than many other decks because of the way in which you actually kind of do have to care about off lanes just a little bit. Of course, I don't want to overstate this. You're still Sam Wilsoning people. You're still doing dumb stuff on turn 3. Like, let's not get crazy with it. Sanctum Showdown is still a pretty straightforward game mode. And if you want to build specifically for that game mode, it looks a lot like this. Now, there is one variation of this list, which would be including Werewolf by Night, which is a pretty reasonable option. That is diving even further into the let's win with the Guardians game plan, though. And Werewolf by Night is a little bit awkward to actually play on 3. So what's actually happening here is we are just all-inning the Sanctum every turn. That's it. That's all we're doing. We all in the Sanctum. We have all the cards that gain stuff whenever your opponent plays on the Sanctum. We go Sanctum, Sanctum, Sanctum. Maybe the game gets turn 6. We really hope it doesn't. We have Vision moving around as our top end, which is a very powerful tool against the sort of control decks in Sanctum that looks to play bigger guys later. Vision can help us, I guess the word would be scale into the late game by moving his 8 power butt around the board, giving us effectively a free 8 at every location, at every Sanctum, every time the turn goes past 5. However, we got to make sure we're in the right matchup for that because a lot of the time we can just win the game on turn 5 by winning Sanctum 3, 4, and 5. In the conversation about control decks, here's kind of what a control deck looks like. And I know that's a little bit weird to describe this as a control deck. It's not like we're controlling anything per se. What we're really controlling is just by the time we get to like turn 6, turn 7, our guys are winning the Sanctum. We have the Infinite, we're winning the Sanctum. We have a giant Red Hulk, we're winning the Sanctum. And I'm not sure Red Hulk is the exact best guy here. Not a lot of skipping happening in the mode just yet, but I don't really have a better option for like really big guy. Gore, maybe, but like you just end up in this, with this deck, you have a lot of the early game of the other deck, and then you're sort of, if you want to play the Infinite, you end up sacrificing turn 4 in exchange for like a much more guaranteed turn 6. That is like a reasonable way to try to play this deck, getting the numbers on the board at the very highest level of card quality. That's kind of what the Infinite represents in this game mode. And so you have this very overpowering like Vision Infinite thing going on, which is really relevant. You can also play the move package in Sanctum. It has a lot of unique and cool abilities here, much like how in the previous deck we talked about, there is going to be some like Infinite and Ghost Spider the Infinite over kind of deal. Move has the same dynamic, but it's just, in my opinion, just that much harder to actually play well. Like, this is a deck that can scale super high. You have Ghost Spider, you have Doctor Strange, so you're always contesting the Sanctum in powerful and meaningful ways. You have even a Heimdall. If the stars align and a Heimdall can actually do what you want it to do, that's a really powerful thing in this game mode. A lot of the time, unfortunately, the stars do not align because you are doing this Ghost Spider, Doctor Strange stuff. Your actual move scalars end up usually in like the 3rd spot, and you feel kind of stupid about having the Heimdall in here. It can happen, but it doesn't always. This is a deck that has a lot of ability to redistribute power, where other decks are going for all in, I'm going to play a bunch of guys. This is a deck that is like, oh, I only have so many points, but they're always exactly where I need them to be. Afflict decks have existed in Sanctum basically the whole time. I do think it's kind of cool that while we showed like basically 4 decks running Sam and Cull Obsidian, this deck is the one deck that's like, no, Cull Obsidian, I got no time for that. One of the things that you'll have noticed about every other deck is like they're basically like, 9 out of 12 cards in them for most of them are going to be like pretty small dudes, which means Man-Thing is a very dominant turn 4 play that can be extremely powerful. You also have these later scalers like Ajax, things like that. You get to cheat energy with 4/7s, which is always relevant. Laufey is an extremely powerful card in the context of Sanctum Showdown. The deck is basically exactly the ladder deck, but with Sam Wilson in it, because you can't not run Sam Wilson in this game mode. Sorry, free-to-players. But on the whole, what's happening here is very similar to the ladder version. And so what you're doing is just contest, but you do it with a flavor of Afflict rather than the Guardians or something of that nature. All right, y'all. Thank you for watching the video. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Remember to like and subscribe if you got this far in the video, please. It really helps me. And of course, thank you again. I will see you in the next one.